welcome to GearCast. I'm Kevin Peckham, your host, and today I'm joined by two special guests that are here from Daking Audio, and Geoff Daking, the namesake of the company, is to my right, and also joined by Mark Hornsby, who is going to join our discussion today, because what we have here, I think, is an excellent representation of what I call modern vintage. And to explain what that's all about, I can't think of anybody who'd do that better than yourself, Geoff. You're kind of a vintage guy too, and maybe your background would help explain why you would be a good spokesman for modern vintage audio.
Because I qualify for Social Security?
Absolutely,
is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I come
I'm with you, brother.
I come from both sides of the glass. I started off in the 60s in a rock and roll band, recording, making albums for Mercury Records, a band called Blues Magoos. And then in 1970, I went into the studio business, and I was a full-time recording engineer from 1970 to 1996. And in that time, I made a lot of records and film scores and commercials and things like that, and worked with people like, I did a lot of the Bat Out of Hell album with Meatloaf, did jazz records with Buddy Rich, all sorts of rock and roll records with Foghat and Eric Clapton and all sorts of people. But
bunch of demos, basically.
Bunch of demos, that's it. But in about 1988, when MIDI came in, by then I'd built about a dozen studios for different people. And MIDI came in and people were starting to put studios in their own homes. And they were recording to these, most of these guys were recording to the Akai 12 track, if anybody remembers that. It was an integrated, it was a console and recorder in one box that recorded on video.
Revolutionary at its time, yeah.
It was revolutionary. It sounded pretty bad, but it was revolutionary. So these people would come to me and say, you know, I got this thing and I'm doing these demos and they really don't sound very good. And what can I do to make it sound better? So there really wasn't much in the way of outboard gear. We didn't have this plethora of mic pre's that we have now. It was basically a couple of API pieces, I think Demeter, and maybe one or two others. So at the time I had a studio with 3 rooms. We had an API, a Neve, and a Trident. And I got together with all the engineers that worked in the studio, and we all agreed that of all the consoles we ever worked on, the best ever sounding was the Trident A-Range. So I went to Trident because these people wanted something, and I said to Phil Wagner, I said, why don't you make the A-Range module again? And they said, we have no interest in doing that. The guys in England, all they want to do is make this vector that's computerized and all this stuff. And he said, why don't you do it? So they sold me the schematic for $50. I borrowed everybody laughs at that.
Did you drive a harder bargain than the
you know, it came from the parts department. And
they wanted 60, I think. And
yeah,
he
exactly.
talked them down.
Talked him down.
And I borrowed an A-Range module from Lenny Kravitz, and a spare from his console, and I started making these modules. And what we make is actually an improved version of the A-Range, and I know everybody's suspicious about improvements, but we just made it better, and we gapped the inductors so it's has more headroom. We got rid of all those looms of wire. Everything's on a PC board. It's very reliable stuff, and we've been making it since 1993.
That's where this term, what I've been calling this modern vintage, which is not your term, I realize, but I own a lot of vintage gear, but it is a pain to keep it all running, and that doesn't all sound a lot because it's old product. And there's a lot of old capacitors and components in there, and as much as people admire it, it isn't as consistent as they probably think it is. But what you're making is consistent, and what you're making is it's all the beauty of that vintage circuit. It's all of that with modern production, and at this point, the reliability that goes with it.
Well, our stuff is very consistent. It's literally within 100th of a dB from unit to unit. The old ones, you know, they had parts problems getting the consistent parts flow. They were using 5 and 10% resistors. This stuff is extremely tight in specification, and it's also almost everything is mounted on the PC board. The old vintage stuff, especially the Neves. You'll look inside, it has miles of wire going to points in the board, and you know those solder connections get bad, and they're very unreliable, especially the switches, the connections to the switches. Now, Mark has had some of this my gear since, I want to say 1994.
94 and 95, I'm based out of Java Jive Studio in Nashville, and we got the first production run of the mic pre-EQ, the FET2 compressor, It had the.
It just happened to be right here.
It just happened to be right here, and they came with, at that time, you shipped it with an outboard external power supply.
Right.
And from the time that went into the rack till now, it's never been recapped. It's never been taken out of the rack. It's used every week on sessions. Never had a problem with it, and it sounds exact. I mean, I've put it up against these modules, which make their way in and out of my studio as well, and the sound is the same.
Sounds like a new unit.
Yeah, so, you know, when people use the term vintage these days, you know, you've got this catchphrase of, oh, Neve 1073 this, or in this case, if you wanted to be comparable, a Neve 1081 with the 4-band EQ would be a comparable unit to this. And, you know, a pair of those, you know, conservatively priced would be around $10,000. And if you live in a major music city, well, that's great. You know, I'm fortunate I live in Nashville and I have access to, you know, people that can repair gear. But the reality is, you know, $10,000 for vintage gear and, you know, a pair of these mic pre EQs are what, Jeff? A couple grand?
About $2,850 map.
$2,850 with a warranty. And, you know, TransAudio and Daking does an excellent job. I mean, if you call, you know, if you call on a weekend, Jeff will answer the phone. So, but, you know,
Don't call him.
unless there's, I personally, you know, Butch Vig is a big fan of this stuff. He's got some of the original modules that you made.
He does.
A lot of artists, a lot of songwriters, a lot of producers, a lot of engineers are people that are using this gear. They're very popular in Nashville. I don't know of anybody that's ever had to ship one back that's been broken unless it's some shipping thing. So the concept of getting a vintage sound, you know, and then looking at a price point of $3,000 versus $10,000, is the quality equal to the price difference? I don't know. I'd say that'd probably be a hard call.
Well, let's talk about what's inside of them too. We just talked about the fact that the designs for the preamps were originally part of the console strips in the Trident A range console.
In the A range, in the discrete A range.
And that's where I'm going with this. Now we're talking all discrete components, and that's still the case today. As you say, you've gone to a circuit board construction, eliminates some of the internal wiring, but we're still looking at all the same discrete components inside. This isn't a compromise circuit with some integrated circuits that weren't there originally.
No, and it also has an input transformer. The original transformers are no longer available. We use Jensen, which is sort of, I like to equate that to, you know, sort of having a Porsche engine in your car. It's a very high-end transformer. It's very transparent. And every preamp we make has a Jensen input transformer. So, and they all have a tremendous amount of gain. The Mic Pre 1 has 70. These have 75 dB of gain, so you can use them on ribbon microphones, recording very low-level signals.
And also, you've done a couple of enhancements that weren't on the original modules. For example, you've got a really interesting application of a high-pass filter on the preamp here that we were looking at. You've also applied it to the compressors. So tell us about that a little, if you will.
Okay, specifically in the Mic Pre 1, this was made specifically for people who have a workstation and only use one microphone. And unlike real studio, what I call real studios that maybe have a pair of 15s on each side and a good acoustic environment that's quiet and
isolated floor,
isolated floor, quiet air conditioning, very low noise level. Plus the fact that especially in the older days when you were using 30 IPS tape, it was impossible to record anything below 40 hertz. And if you did, you could hear it. Now, people are recording at home. They have, you know, the dog running around, the refrigerator running in the next room, you know, the air conditioning humming in the dining room, whatever. And they're monitoring on tiny little speakers, which don't give you any low end. And your digital audio workstation will record right down to 10 hertz, no problem. So it's very simple to fill your recordings with all kinds of crap in the bottom. So what we did here is we put in a high-pass filter, which goes from 10 hertz to 200 hertz. And this, what I recommend is on virtually everything that you record, listen to it, and then bring the high-pass filter up until you can begin to feel it, and then back it off a little bit. And that you'll be taking out all that rubbish down at the bottom. Now, maybe on a bass drum or a bass or something, you're not going to want to go up, but most of the time, vocals, guitars, or acoustic guitars, you know, you don't want that trash down at the bottom.
It all adds up too. I mean,
Oh, and it adds up and it piles up and it has a tremendous amount of energy. You got to remember that low frequency material has the most amount of energy, and it will just fill up your mix and you won't know why.
Pops on vocal tracks. You'll never hear that on a, there are pops that, I hear all the time that are down and that hit down to the 30 hertz range that you'll never hear on these 4-inch woofers that people are, listening back on at home. So, they may think their mix is all great and everything's fine. Then, they go play it on a full range system after they've already pressed up a bunch of CDs, and then you've got this major low end problem and noises and artifacts.
Or they don't understand why they're having a hard time getting a good mix. It sounds muddy. And then what they do is they start adding highs. One of the things you'll find with this is that in recording, a lot of times when you don't like the sound of something, instead of trying to boost something, try take your equalizer and boost, and then look for the ugliest frequency, and then try pulling that out. Well, in this case, the ugly frequencies are going to be very low things. So you'll find that an acoustic guitar in this demo we did sounds much brighter when you take the mud off the bottom. And we're not talking about the actual signal of the guitar, we're talking the ambience.
It's the ambience of the room, and it's all added up.
Right.
And it's also doing false triggering. If someone's going to take this and run through compressors downstream or whatever, you've got all this energy that's going to get in there and contaminate what it's using for its sensing and cause all kinds of troubles.
Even more important if you're going to compress your mix, because now your compressor is going to be working on that low frequency material. Well, we have a solution for that.
I thought you might. All right.
So there you go. Now in the new we make 2 compressors. These are mono compressors. We've been making these for about 15 years. The FET2 is, as like its name, it's an FET transistor is used as the gain change element. It has the same amplifiers as the mic pre-EQ, but everything on here is stepped. Then we make the FET3. This is, every adjustment on this, except for the ratio, is continuously variable. This is for the people who want to be able to have instant repeatability, and this is for the people who want to be able to get in the cracks. The other feature that we've added on this is that before the peak detector, we've put the exact same high-pass filter that we use in this mic pre before the peak detector. That means that if you have a lot of low-frequency material, let's say that noise that you don't realize that you've recorded, or let's say you're doing urban music or something that has a tremendous amount of low-frequency material, or just rock and roll with bass and drums, you can put these high-pass filters in. Now these aren't in the signal path. These are only in front of the peak detector. Yeah. And that will keep the peak detector and the limiter from being moved by the low-frequency energy. And because one of the things that will happen, for instance, if you have a big bass drum, is it's actually going to modulate the vocals. Every time the bass drum hits, the vocal goes down a little bit. So here we can actually tune it out. The other thing we did in this unit that's unique is that in this mode, it's 2 independent mono limiters. And in this mode, it's fully linked. But what we did was, we have a different method of creating the stereo linking. Instead of doing it with a control voltage, we actually do it by taking the audio from the opposite side and summing it before the peak detector in the other side. So in this case, the amount of limiting is continuous, the amount of stereo limiting is continuously variable from full stereo to anywhere in between. So you have more control over the stereo image, especially if you have instruments of different levels and different sizes. Maybe
you want a little bit of that separation in the compressor. I think it's a very interesting feature, and I'm not actually aware of it in any other product, but it's an interesting idea. And that's only occurring in the detector, where we sum the audio together on the detector chain for the compressor.
Right. It has nothing to do with the actual audio that's coming out. It's only
a
in the
side
detector.
chain processing, basically, that's going
right.
on there. And we went right past it, but one of the things I certainly want to talk about is the EQ section. Now the EQ section is from the Trident circuits. Is that authentic to the original consoles?
It's pretty authentic. It's very authentic, but we did 2 things. One is which we gapped the inductors a little wider so that it has more headroom. This is +30. And the other thing is that because I'm using a different switch, a modern switch, I have 1 extra frequency in each band. And so because of that, the frequency bands actually overlap, which the original didn't. These will boost and cut about +17. So, and they're very smooth. You can turn these, put in a signal that's +10, and boost it full up, and you'll still have headroom. It won't distort. And they're very, very smooth.
Very musical.
Yeah, very musical.
Well, now I know Geoff likes this product. That's pretty obvious. But Mark, you've been using this for a long time. From an application standpoint, where is this your secret weapon? Where does this get applied?
Well, the first thing with you're talking about the EQ. It's one of the richest sounding EQs I have, and like you said, with the headroom that's there, you can't screw it up. You know, there's so many equalizer circuits that are out there, not only in consoles but in their outboard gear, to where after you get past about 6 dB or 7 dB,
right, you get a little red flashing light at that point.
You start to have to make an executive decision on, okay, I want to change this frequency, but I'm hearing the artifacts. And this doesn't do this. It's very rich. It's very smooth sounding. So from an application point of view, personally, I'm not someone that just jumps in and starts EQing. But in the case of drums or anything that has a lot of resonant frequencies, yeah, I do that a lot. And the Daking stuff is always the first call on the drums. Best drum sounds I've ever gotten are out of a rack of Daking gear, period. And the compressor is great, especially the FET 3. FET 2 we've been using for years on drums and vocals. You can really bear down the attack time on the FET 2. You know, you speed it up tremendously and just bury that needle. And you really, and I don't know how you did this, but you don't hear the artifacts. Most compressors, after you get 7, 8 dB in, it dulls out, or there's distortion, or there's some very obvious artifacts that jump out at you. While you still hear that much compression, the signal doesn't break up.
The frequency response doesn't change. A lot of limiters, as they limit, they either lose mid-range or they lose top end. And this one is, you can limit 24 dB and it'll still be flat to 80 kilohertz.
Yeah. Now, the other thing I'll comment on, the FET 3, the high-pass filter trick is very new and is very proactive in a compressor. I can't think of off the top of my head another compressor on the market that has that. So it's almost like having part of a multi-band built into it in a different kind of way. Last night, we were in Chicago, and we walked in on this session where a guy had this mix-up, and he was using a couple plugins, a couple very expensive, very well-known plugins on the market, some plugins that I use quite a bit. And the Daking rack was sitting there, and we had it set up because we were doing a presentation that evening for a group of people. And so we said, can we patch this in and just compare the two and match your settings that you have on your 2 mix versus this? And it was shocking how bad the plug-in sounded with the same amount of compression versus the FET 3. What it was doing to the cymbals on the drums was absolutely atrocious. And when he walked into the room, I'd already jumped in on this, and I had the plug-in set up and I had the compressor set up, and he walked in. I said, well, let Geoff take a crack at this. He's the seasoned pro here. And he sat down and he listened to the plug-in, and he didn't even look at what it was or where it was coming from. He says, I don't know what that is, but it sounds terrible. And sure enough, we A-B'd it, and the client, the artist whose mix it was, who was a younger fellow who's, I'd say, up and coming in the industry, he felt the same way. He was blown away that a box, an outboard box compared to this very popular, very expensive plug-in, was so drastically different and better for the sound. Now, that's not to say that, there's not, plugins certainly have their place, and we all love them and use them, and there's some great sounding plugins out there, but that's pretty cool.
And what's more, you'll never have to update it when you change your operating system.
That sums it up pretty well.
You kind of lose. I'm at a loss for words because I know this stuff lasts because I've had it forever. And, I've mixed a lot of different genres of music, and I've used a lot of plugins, and I'm very deep into digital audio workstation stuff. So to have a compressor to where really quickly I can dial in a sound that smashes a plugin I've been doing for years, that grabs my attention. And I think it'll grab other people's attention as well.
Well, we were demoing this earlier. We were all talking about the versatility, and you mentioned something I thought that was very valid. There are a lot of classic compressors, and I'm not talking now just about the plugins, but certainly the plugins that emulate the hardware are the same boat. Mm-hmm. There are some classic tools that we go to for certain kinds of things, and Those compressors, those limiters are known for that. But when you start to use them for a lot of other things, then the magic is gone. All of a sudden, it's like, well, that isn't so spectacular when I use it on vocals. It's great on drums, but it isn't great on vocals or whatever. But it was very interesting to hear your discussion of who's using it, what they're using it for. This isn't a one-trick pony. This is something that has been applied to vocals. It's been used for drums. It's being used on acoustic instruments. This is a very interesting, very versatile performer. And I'm referring to the compressors at this point.
Yeah, the compressors, you know, we have well over 100 rack spaces of outboard gear in our studio, aside from a 48-channel console. And those are the only the Daking compressors are the only ones that, if there's pressure, if there's a time crunch, if I'm unsure, I know I can run a signal through that and it's going to sound good. Now, it may not always be the absolute best thing for that source, but it's never going to sound bad. It's always going to work, it's going to do its job, and it's going to sound good. Now, everybody, you know, if you got the time, I mean, but there's so much gear out there, everything sounds different. You know, sometimes you need different elements for different things. But I know I can grab those, or if I'm walking into a studio that I don't know, I can take a rack of this gear with me, and I'm going to come out of there with something I'm satisfied with, and the client's going to be satisfied with.
Well, that's kind of the definition of a good value, I think.
Well, it's security, yeah, you know, and you know, I think you feel the same way. You know, get in, get the job done, and get home.
My motto is get home early.
There you go. Well, Geoff, thank you also for bringing such great products to market and not feeling compelled to make lots more models. I think there's a lot of value in offering excellent products that have a long life and become classic tools because people use them year after year and they're glad that they bought them. And when people come out with a new product every year, you kind of wonder, what was wrong with the one last year? So it's very refreshing to see this, and we like it.
Well, I resist that trendy. I just try to make things that I would like to use in a way that I would like to use them. They're very simple to use, very straightforward. Anybody can look at that compressor and figure out exactly what each knob is supposed to do.
And I like the metering. Thanks very much. So.
Well, there you go.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you for training our staff on these, and I know they're very excited to have these to sell. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Mark.